There's this famous scene in South Park where the Underpants Gnomes explain their plan to make money as,
Phase 1, we collect underpants. Yeah, but what about phase 2? Well, phase 3 is profit, get it?
I don't get it.
You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit.
the longer I'm enmeshed in the world of Fallout, the more convinced I become that something about Vault-Tec is just wrong. The dominant fan theories, the bits of story dropped by Bethesda and Obsidian, even Amazon just straight up telling us Vault-Tec wants to rule the world, don't really add up. It's like some vital piece of information is missing, because sometimes Vault-Tec acts like a big evil corporation, and sometimes they act like the Enclave, and sometimes they act like agents of chaos, but a more 40k kind of chaos than Joker kind of chaos, if you will. I mean, basically the TLDR is that when taken as a whole, Vault-Tec's behavior doesn't make sense. They aren't really committed to the Enclave, and they don't consistently act like some shadowy cabal of people that want to rule the world or really even want money. Their plans, their studies, their vaults, starting the war, none of it really feels consistent. And I think I know why. Simply enough, Vault-Tec makes no sense because we are looking at it the wrong way. Vault-Tec's not behaving like we think they should because Vault-Tec's not what we think they are. So what if I told you that we were all wrong about Vault-Tec and that their nonsensical behavior was actually perfectly sensible for an organization whose goal was not money or power or space exploration or even world conquest, but subversion? Of course, the Underpants Gnome's business plan seems to fit with the anti-corporatist world building that has always been a part of Fallout. Greedy corporations run by a bunch of power-obsessed zealots who think that whose inability to think beyond the next quarter's profits make them effectively stupid and functionally amoral, if not actively evil, destroy the world. Robco is straight up evil. John Caleb Bradburton, the Nuka-Cola guy? Evil. Speaking of, what the hell happened to Coca-Cola? The divergence mostly happens like 60 years after Coke was invented. I went to war with us, for God's sake. Like, it's odd that it doesn't exist. West-Tec, the FEV folks, they're like holy god evil. Like the kind of evil that worries other evil people. An atomic age Der Levanga brigade, if you will. But even then, even as evil as they are, all of them were evil in a recognizably corporate way. Which is to say, money. Vault-Tec has always seemed a little different. A bit more unhinged, harder to pin down. Sure, Vault-Tec was interested in money and power and had the same cruel indifference to human suffering that was seemingly endemic to most pre-apocalypse American businesses. Much love to you, them. But there always seemed to be something darker and kind of radically illogical to Vault-Tec's behavior. Like, West-Tec did truly awful things, but at least they fit in with a pattern and seem to provide, well, some kind of useful information. At times, at least. Vault-Tec just isn't that consistent. Look at Vault 75, genetic engineering to create child soldiers. Yeah, the whole thing is evil as shit, but at least it has some kind of logic to it. It's an experiment. Can we do this? Can we torture and genetically engineer our way to the ideal soldier? Which, honestly, is not all that dissimilar to West-Tec and FEV. But then you have something like Vault 95, where you take a bunch of junkies, put them into a treatment program for 5 years, and force sober living on them for that entire time. And this is after the bombs drop, mind you, and thus your little recovery program represents a significant fraction of the non-irradiated humans left on the planet, and who are therefore potentially more valuable than, well, just about anything. And then at the end of those 5 years, you release some drugs into their society to see what happens. And everybody knows what happens. Even if you have never played the game, I assure you, your first guess is absolutely right. Hell, everyone involved, from the scientists to the janitors, had to know what was going to happen when this idea was proposed. So, what's the value in this experiment? What do we learn from this that is useful in traveling to another world, to establishing a new home, a new America? How does withholding and then giving junkies drugs advance your plan to rule the world? There is no way this experiment was of any real value because the outcome was a foregone conclusion and wasted an incredibly rare resource. Now, perhaps you want to counter and say, hey, maybe the idea was to test whether being away from drugs and alcohol for an extended period of time would create a durable cure. Okay, but what the hell does this have to do with anything Vault-Tec is doing? Saving the best and the brightest? Okay, yeah, some of those folks may have dependency issues, fair enough, but you're not going to put them all in the same vault. Traveling to another planet? A rocket full of junkies to establish this new America? What is this, ship number 4? Honestly, the failure of this vault was inevitable. Before the ink had dried on the proposal, people would have known in broad strokes what the outcome would be. Which begs the question, why do it? Why run an experiment that you essentially know the answer to? Why run an experiment that uses an exceedingly rare resource and doesn't really provide you with any useful information? Why run an experiment if all it does is inflict pain and kill? But let's take the humans in the vaults as essentially worthless to the Enclave and Vault-Tec. Fallout 1 and 2 seem to argue for this. What experiments weren't run that could have provided real, useful information? How many of these were not done to watch a bunch of recovering addicts fall apart? To my mind, this couldn't have been an Enclave experiment. It had to be a Vault-Tec project. And if so, it hints at something far more sinister in Vault-Tec's motives than simply being the underpants gnomes. Because if Vault-Tec were driven by profit and power like Robco and West-Tec, then something like Vault 75 just shouldn't happen. It's unprofitable. It creates no power. And so, like everyone else with a Fallout addiction, I've come to question the actions of Vault-Tec. Who they were working for, why those experiments, or any experiments. Did they start the war? How many vaults were there? Were there any competitors to Vault-Tec? I mean, other than the Pulowski people, because, you know, we have different sodas and cigarettes and car makers, so why not say Biff's Bomb Shelters? But it wasn't until I began wandering through Vault 96 that I really became convinced that something was seriously wrong with the way Vault-Tec behaved. Now, in this video, I am going to be talking a lot about how so much of Vault 96 makes no sense, and how this points to a bigger problem with Vault-Tec. But I want to start with one person, Jeanette Higgins, because her inclusion in this project is so nonsensical, so intensely bizarre that it makes it clear that Vault-Tec isn't playing the same game that Robco and West-Tec are, nor do they seem to be playing for the Enclave or even themselves. As Jeanette herself notes, if this research was so damn important, why just us? Why don't we have a full team of people who actually know shit about biology? Jeanette Higgins was a senior engineer at Robco and the lead developer of the Assaultron, one of the premier killing machines in both the pre- and post-war worlds of Fallout. My first experience with them, as reenacted here, was terrifying.
Oh golly gee, is that a new robot? Never seen one quite like that before. Hopefully it'll be just as easy to defeat as all the others are. Blah!
And not to put too fine of a point on it, but even with a few thousand hours or so in Fallout 4 and 76, running into an Assaultron can still be a hassle. So ensuring the safety and survival of someone that talented and that capable makes sense. After all, the vaults were presented as a meritocracy and largely weighted towards the elites. In most cases. Or rather, this should make sense. But as I said, Vault 96 doesn't make sense. To the outside world and even its occupants, prior to the end of the world, Vault 96 was basically an ark. A giant freezer built to preserve specimens of healthy animals and reintroduce them to the world once things had returned to normal. So then, what's the designer of military-grade robots doing there? Well, I suppose one could argue that it was convenient. Assuming she worked at the West Virginia Robco facility, she probably lived in Watoga, or less likely Bogtown, and given the constraints of an impending nuclear holocaust, Vault 96 would have been fairly easy for her to reach, making it something of an ideal place to stash her away while ensuring her survival and potentially a way to access her because undoubtedly Vault-Tec, the Enclave, and Robco would understand the value of someone like Jeanette. But here's the thing, once the doors had closed, the handful of people locked in Vault 96 found that they weren't really going to be post-apocalyptic wildlife conservationists. They were really genetic engineers, and their actual job was to introduce mutations into the samples of frozen animals and have them fight one another, thereby identifying new and potentially useful traits. But that's not really the Vault-Tec way, so to ensure a properly puritanical work ethic and really drive that stress response, each week they would need to produce more mutants than the previous week. Of course, for Vault-Tec, failure must always carry a severe penalty, so if they failed, they would be put to death by the Vault robots, which is both insane and very on brand for Vault-Tec. And since human life, or at least these lives, had no value to Vault-Tec, the Overseer had orders to eliminate them after about 5 years, no matter how successful they had been. This is true madness. Jeanette, a talented designer of autonomous weapon systems, wasn't being saved from dying in the apocalypse. No, again, her death was just being delayed. Maybe she was a junkie? Maybe they were all junkies. Placing Jeanette in Vault 96, where her talents would not only be greatly underutilized, but could also potentially subvert their own experiment by, overriding the robot's kill commands, could possibly be explained away as a variable, or part of a more complex test. But no matter what she did, Vault-Tec and whomever else seemingly wanted her dead, just at a later date. For some reason. And this makes no sense. Because why kill a rock star? Why lock away and torture and then kill someone so talented? Someone who has been devoted to your cause? Why put her in a position where her specific skill set could potentially nullify the robot threat and thereby your entire experiment? Why not place her in Vault 76, a control vault just a bit further up the road that was meant to house some of the region's best and brightest who would then emerge to reclaim the post-war world for whoever? But also, and again knowing Vault-Tec, this is almost certainly the real goal of Vault 76, the Overseer of Vault 76 was to take over any remaining nuclear silos, ensuring Vault-Tec's power in the post-war era. And of course, those silos had assaultrons for protection, but as we all know, you definitely don't want to bring the person that created the mighty killbots along when you go to deal with the mighty killbots. That'd just be crazy. Clearly, Vault-Tec weren't out to save the world. That's just what they told people. As players, we're meant to believe that the real Vault-Tec is the one that presented plans at shadowy corporate retreats and liaised with the Enclave and stored people in cryopods. But their treatment of Jeanette doesn't really align with this either. Locking her in a vault only to kill her 5 years later would seem to align more clearly with an entirely different plan. An interesting constant of the Fallout universe is that no one really knew when the vaults would be able to open. Certainly Vault-Tec hoped that the world would be inhabitable in just a few months or maybe decades, so the short-term nature of vaults like 111 and 76 made sense. Protect some of the most educated, capable, and wealthy people in America, ensuring that their offspring or their offspring's offspring, the children of the best and the brightest, if you will, would be ready to rebuild America. So in general, regardless of whether a vault was intended to be inhabited for a short or long period of time, they usually had relatively large, genetically diverse populations of overachievers that were able to produce their own food, water, and air almost indefinitely. Thus, most vaults were meant to survive 100 or 200 years, maybe even more, across multiple generations in a largely self-sustaining manner without ever interacting with the outside world. Vault 96, however, was decidedly incapable of this kind of long-term survival. Now, Any biologist worth, well, their logis is going to wonder how 5 people with an average age of 46.6, placing both the men and women largely past their reproductive prime, are going to be capable of running a facility like this for the decades it's likely to require, even on the low end. Because we have to remember the inhabitants signed up to be Noahs, repopulating the world with animals from their frozen ark once background radiation levels reached an acceptable range. The actual genetic engineering project wasn't what they were sold on. And age aside, even if they had all been of ideal reproductive age and, into it.
In the buff, being rude, doing stuff with the food, getting lewd with his food. We heard that's what you are into.
The genetic diversity across 5 people whose offspring might need to survive for 200 years is maybe a bit too on the nose for a game set in West Virginia. Because pretty quickly those family trees are going to stop branching and everybody is going to look like a 16th or 17th century European monarch. Not to mention that 2 of the women, including the most ideal candidate for reproduction, are in a relationship. Now, I've always loved that gender, sexuality, and race are less of an issue in the Fallout universe than our own. Well, unless you're Chinese. But in a situation like this, where we are contemplating the long-term survival of Vault that might be central to Earth's post-apocalyptic recovery, sexual preferences, genetic diversity, and reproduction become existential questions. Hell, the Fallout TV show basically doesn't happen if this isn't a concern. That being said, I have absolutely no desire to see the LGBTQIA+ community excluded from vaults, and honestly, in vaults with a larger population, such concerns are largely outweighed by the staggering benefits of diversity, and should be encouraged, though I do wonder if IVF is a thing in the Fallout universe. But a moment's thought, a moment's reflection is all it should take to realize that 5 mostly middle-aged people can't support the plans of Vault 96 in any meaningful way and should have raised some serious red flags. But those aren't the only personnel problems. Vault 96 was sold as a zoological facility, so you'd expect the staff to be experts in mammals or fish, reptiles, bugs. Maybe some would be veterinarians or wildlife biologists. Even a cell or molecular biologist could fit in pretty well. More than likely, you'd expect a mixture where each scientist had an extensive understanding of general biological theories and laboratory techniques, coupled to an array of useful and complementary specializations. Well, that is, unless you were the sociopath who had been tasked with creating whatever hell Vault 96 actually was. Because instead of an array of biologists, the staff of Vault 96 included a computer programmer, the Vault engineer, which, fair, a microbiologist who, probably will have some utility, a geneticist, which, again, fair, and Jeanette Higgins, our wayward military roboticist. You'll notice that most of these folks don't fit in with the ARC plan, and clearly they also don't fit in with the genetic engineering plan either. Couple this to the fact that each person was remarkably accomplished, just generally not as a biologist, and the truly disturbing nature of Vault-Tec's succeed or die, but hey, also succeed and die plan becomes evident. Before we begin looking at the staff, though, I should probably give a little of my own background, because in my day-to-day life, I am a molecular biologist, and this has definitely colored my perspective on the whole thing that is Vault 96. Primarily, I've worked as a researcher in academia, but I also spent a bit of time at a biotech startup and as an instructor at a technical school. Indeed, I feel a strong affinity for the staff of Vault 96 because their actual genetic engineering project is fairly similar to the kinds of things I do professionally, only, real and not crazy. Like, getting one thing to express the genes of another is just a Tuesday to me, but sadly, even if it sounds pretty awesome, no one is going to give us grant money to then have those things fight. We begin with the biologists Nina Valea and Molly Cooper. Geneticist and chief researcher Nina Valea, 44, was both a respected scientist and business owner who, prior to entering Vault 96, had started her own biotech company, Chromax Genetics, following a 4-year stint at Westech. Before that, she had spent 2 years at Oresa Polytechnic, likely as a postdoc. For some reason, Nina has PhDs in both genetics and biology, which, while I realize that multiple PhDs is often used as shorthand for really smart in science fiction, it's not really a thing in the real world. Sure, you might get a PhD in English and chemistry, since those are radically different fields with different ways of doing research and different ways of knowing, but science is kind of science. Having a PhD in genetics and biology is like having 2 PhDs in biology, since Genetics is an offshoot of biology, and to have a PhD in genetics, you'd need a very strong understanding of biology. Like, seriously, in science, everyone studies everything. Physicists study biology, and biologists study chemistry, and computer science people work on everything because, well, data is data and numbers are numbers. Honestly, her 2 PhDs should raise some questions because that's like a decade of work, and unless she really liked making minimum wage for doing research, teaching undergrads, and wasn't all that creative, there's no way she should have the patience to write 2 theses or work on somebody else's ideas for that long. Apparently, she was also known to be morally flexible, which makes you wonder exactly how evil you need to be so that you are part of the Vault-Tec in-group. Conversely, her partner and the chief biologist of Vault-96, Molly Cooper, was just 29 when she entered the Vault, having worked at Chromax Genetics for about a year prior to the apocalypse. This fits in line pretty well with her getting a BS at 22, finishing her PhD in microbiology after 5 or 6 years, which is pretty standard, and then Chromax being her first real job. If anybody was bothered by the fact that Nina was in a relationship with an employee young enough to be her child, or HR even existed, is unclear. But again, clearly this behavior wasn't questionable enough to make her safe from Vault-Tec, leading one to question, no really, who do you have to kill to be a part of the Vault-Tec in-group? Or is there something else? And that's it. 2 biologists. 2 biologists were expected to complete a growing number of experiments each week and held the lives of Hans Memling, Eric Marcos, and Jeanette Higgins in their hands because, as Jeanette says, the rest of them were just glorified support staff. Jeanette, fix this Protectron. Hans, stop that cryo leak. Eric, just get out of the way.
I am a scientist, I seek to understand me, all of my impurities and evils yet unknown.
Vault-Tec doesn't give a shit about the experiments done in Vault-96 because Vault-96 is a lie. It's not an ARC, but it's also not a genetic engineering facility. No one cares if they succeed or fail, so long as they're otherwise occupied. The experiments themselves are busy work, and while the results are being recorded, I doubt that anyone anywhere is paying attention to them. And yeah, the science of the Fallout universe is different than ours, but the things that allow me to say it's a lie shouldn't differ all that much. The scientific method, time, communication, all these things should really be relatively consistent between our world and theirs. But exploring Vault-96 left me confused, because the way Molly and Nino were doing science, let alone how Vault-Tec seemed to want them to do science, was just wrong. Now, I realize a lot of this has to do with it being a game, and that things are done to work for the story and not to show how science is actually done. Much as I realize that Coke isn't really missing from the Fallout universe, they just didn't want to license it.
No Coke, Pepsi.
But at the same time, as Oxhorn once mentioned, we have to take the lore as presented. We can't really use external factors as an excuse for something that doesn't make sense. So, if we handwave the science, that's just how it is in the Fallout universe, then we're still left with the problem of how they do science in Vault-96, and much like how Jeanette Higgins perfectly encapsulates staffing issues, Sample X001 shows us that Vault-Tec and the scientists of Vault-96 aren't doing science. They're practicing magic, basically. And I don't mean scientifically vetted, well-documented, it's so advanced it seems like magic science. I mean like, honest to God, none shall pass! You're a wizard, Harry. Pre-midichlorian, the Force magic. As a professional scientician, it would honestly be super easy for me to get drawn in by the minutiae of what they were doing wrong in Vault-96, but that'd be pretty meaningless to the vast majority of people that aren't working scientists. And yet, to really understand how insane Vault-96 was, I need you to understand how the process can't work. So I'm going to focus on a few things that highlight the many problems of Vault-96. Timelines, replication and tech transfer, and experimental design. Science takes time. Even with automation, planning, and lots of assistance, science takes time. This is especially true in biology, where you can't outwork the time it takes for something to grow and to develop. You can push it a little, but there are trade-offs. Make the enzyme go too fast, the cells develop quicker, and you increase the probability of errors and mutations. Which means that there is a theoretical limit to the number of mutations the Vault-96 members could generate and characterize in a given week. And God help you if 2 of the mutants were evenly matched. In the Fallout world, much like our own, the first week's requirement of 4 mutations isn't all that much. But as the numbers increase, it becomes more difficult to meet those numbers. Now, in our world, most genetic engineering is done at the cellular level, and with proper foresight, planning, and preparation, it's possible to make thousands to hundreds of thousands of mutants in one large, involved experiment. Characterizing these mutants could then take weeks, months, or even years, while all the planning and preparation might take weeks or months as well. So right away, with its weekly requirements, Vault-Tec is actually eliminating efficiency. Honestly, if you wanted to generate mutations, what do you think would be more efficient? Producing new mutants every week for a few months, or no mutants for several months followed by thousands or more in a single day? But also, complexity takes time. Humans are children for a really long period of time because it takes so long for our exceedingly complex and powerful brains to develop. Similarly, when we step up from working with cells to organisms, even simple multicellular ones like C. elegans, it's going to take more time to create and characterize the mutants, and then each step up in complexity is going to add time. So 100 unique bacterial or yeast mutants might take a week, with planning and such, but 100 mouse or wolf or, God help you, bear mutations are going to take significantly longer. But even then, even if they had technologies that shorten mutation time and hasten development, science still takes time and requires replication. Truth be told, science is usually slow and plodding and methodical. The most important thing in science is not originality or statistics or a hypothesis or even experiments. Honestly, it's reproducibility and replication. It's that what I find isn't specific to me or just a one-off. It's that other people can do it and get the same result. Or as I sometimes joke, it's called research because you're going to do it again. Simply put, it's not science if it happened once. It's luck. You need replication, reproducibility, and statistics and probability and more replication for something to be science. And Vault-Tec, with their hundreds of mutations per week, allow no time for this. No time for replication, no time for repetition, no time for statistics, and thus no time for science. Just magical thinking. Say we make a Pikachu and it defeats a fire-breathing wolf once. That doesn't mean anything. There are thousands, maybe millions of reasons why the wolf loses this time. So you can't say that the Pikachu is better. They need to fight again and again for us to decide which genetics are superior, and even then the answer could well be situational. But Vault-Tec doesn't trade in subtlety or complexity at once one and done. So Molly and Nina don't repeat experiments. They do one-offs and report them as facts, which isn't science. Look at the NBA. In the playoffs, the team that wins the first game goes on to win the series about 78% of the time, but the loser in the World Series, the statistics are even more of a coin toss, with just 64% of the Game 1 winners taking the series. So Pikachu is likely better than the Firewolf, but we can't say that for certain. And we can't say it for anything but the single condition they test in. In fact, replication and reproducibility are so central to science that communication and tech transfer, or explaining to others how to do what we did or how we did what we did, is an almost unbelievably large part of the job. You probably think that scientists are people that wear lab coats and stand at a bench conducting experiments, but honestly, we are much more likely to be at a desk analyzing data and writing than we are isolating, perturbing, and observing the natural world. To guide replication, we create and follow things like standard operating procedures and protocols, write method sections or method papers. We might even follow an instruction manual. But no matter who it is or what it is, they never get it 100% right or anticipate every possible variation or complication. So all the big science companies maintain technical support teams that you can call or write to get help. Some even have field support specialists who come out and work with you one-on-one when things are truly vexing. Same goes for academia. Everyone misses some subtle detail because it's the way their lab works, or maybe something seems clear to them because they have done it a dozen times and wrote it up. But you as a total noob could see it being X or Y. Which is to say that in doing science, there are always questions. Often a phone call or email will solve the problem, but it's also not uncommon to need more hands-on assistance. And honestly, I can't think of a single project I have ever done where, at some point, we didn't have a technical question and have to reach out to somebody with more experience. And that's just a simple fact of science. It's basically a team sport. So when Vault-Tec has the results and protocols transmitted, it has to be for show, because in reality, with no real way for the scientists of Vault 96 to be contacted, once they're dead, their experiments almost certainly can't be replicated. Meaning, again, that Vault-Tec clearly doesn't care about the experiments done in Vault 96. If they did, then they would allow the scientists time to do science and they would ensure communication. But the success or failure of the staff has no bearing on anything.
Genetic Research Log Week 142. Specimen X001 has been a most remarkable success. I confess, I was skeptical when Molly showed me her analysis. There was little to work with, given its unique biology. As an initial bench test, I spliced each of our extant stable mutations into separate samples. They all worked flawlessly, as if we had spent months adapting them. And then the mutations spread. They somehow shifted from one sealed petri dish to the next until all the samples exhibited all of the mutations. Fascinating. I wanted to proceed to live subject testing immediately, but all of our attempts to resuscitate a specimen have been blocked. Hans is looking into it. In the meantime, this transference capability merits further investigation.
In modern biology, we often use fluorescent proteins as a way to identify and track things. These fluorescent proteins come in an array of colors from red to green to yellow to blue and are generally referred to as RFP for red fluorescent protein, or GFP for green fluorescent protein, and so on. Now, the way these proteins work is truly fascinating, but in very general terms, the idea is we shine UV light on something, and if it has the GFP protein, it'll emit or appear green. And if we shine an orangish light on something tagged with the RFP protein, it'll appear red. So, in one of my previous labs, we had two modified versions of a virus. One expressed RFP so that it would look something like this if we shined the right light on it, and another version carried a GFP tag and looked like this when it had the right kind of light shown on it. We worked with these viruses on an almost daily basis, and like clockwork, 24 hours post-infection, you'd see green or red areas where the virus was growing on a bed of cells. Now, the experiments we did with these two strains were different. The red strain told us one thing about the viral life cycle, while the green strain told us another. And so while we often worked with both strains at the same time, we never really mixed them. But every now and then we'd see red and green fluorescence in the same sealed petri dish. But we never ascribed any kind of special abilities to our virus, and neither should have Molly or Nina their cells. Because when Nina says that the mutations spread and they somehow shifted from one sealed petri dish to the next until all of the samples exhibited all the mutations, she's implying that some mystical force specific to sample X001 has allowed or caused this spread or sharing to occur. But it's almost certainly an example of cross-contamination and really should be considered one until proven otherwise. So, what did we do with a red and green petri dish? Well, first you'd trash the experiment and repeat it. Because, again, the most likely answer is cross-contamination. A drop or a splash from one dish ended up in the other. You'd also mention it to your coworkers in case they saw any red or green when they shouldn't, because it's possible that the mixing is caused by a shared tool that has become contaminated. So you repeated the experiment and got the same results. Okay, well, it's probably the tools you use that are contaminated. So take those apart, give them a really good cleaning, and at this point you may want to get fresh aliquots of your reagents and media as well, because there's a good chance those could be contaminated. This time, when you do the experiment, you work much more carefully and may even contemplate using additional precautions like filter tips to decrease the possibility of cross-contamination. Still red and green? Well, now it's time for a lab meeting and some planning. If no one else is having this problem, someone else should try the experiment, but with their reagents and aliquots. Maybe consider a fresh viral stock because yours might have gotten contaminated. Here we are not really looking for a culprit so much as we are a way forward. Often in science, you'll know what the result should be. You've done step 3 of this experiment hundreds of times, and when it's working right, you get blue. But if something has gone wrong, you get red. There are hundreds of things that could cause red instead of blue, but you don't really care. What you need is to get back to blue so that you can do the actual interesting stuff. In one of my labs, we used a handful of yeast strains to run our experiments. We weren't studying the yeast, but using them as tiny reaction vessels, basically. So if they started to act odd, changing growth rates, let's say, or their morphology or how they appeared looked different, we didn't care what had gone wrong with them. We just got new stocks because they were a tool, not the object we were studying. Okay, so new fresh media, fresh cells, fresh viral stocks, all the equipment has been cleaned. Someone else tried it and got the same results. Is it the room? Well, try a new room. Are the green and red colors discrete or coming from the same cell? Well, let's harvest the DNA or RNA from these cells and sequence it. Are we getting a weird recombination of it? Let's look deeper into the literature and see if anybody else has reported this behavior before. Maybe it's gotten into the air. Should we try working in a different lab? Or labs that don't share the same air? If we do, we should probably just work with one strain per lab. Are the staff infected? If we change the GFP to BFP, do we still see this behavior? And this list goes on and on and on, but not for Nina. Not for Molly. They see an aberrant result and treat it like a fact, which is not what scientists do. Science would be collecting data through rigorous, properly controlled experimentation and removing explanations step by step, or, as Holmes said, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But Molly and Nina aren't rigorous. They're rushed. And all of the above would take days, or more likely weeks of work. But for them and the inhabitants of Vault 96, the clock is always ticking, and they must always be productive. So they accept this as a miracle, report the results, and move on. But just because they have results doesn't mean they are good, or believable, or repeatable, which are all things central to science. So I don't think Nina and Molly are bad scientists. I think they're blinded by desperation. And in the end, it's failing to be a scientist. Failing to follow the scientific method and truly dig and do the proper science with sample X001 that is their downfall.
Genetic log week 148, 148. There is little progress to report. Too little. The shifting mutation is still unstable. When stressed, subjects will shift or phase or whatever it is. It works. But it's inconsistent, uncontrollable. Without some understanding of the underlying physics or biology, there is little I can do to stabilize or improve on it. If I could study the original specimen, perhaps I could make some progress. But there is apparently only one subject in a secured cryonics bay with military access controls. I've no doubt Eric could get in, but he has refused. I have put everything into this research. I'm out of time. I will not make my quota. Forgive me, Molly.
And with that, Nina dies. And we have reached the beginning of the end for Vault 96 because they don't understand how what they are seeing is happening. They have pushed and pushed and pushed until the science has pushed back. Cost Nina her life. So Vault 96 is a lie. Great, but that doesn't really answer the question. What is Vault-Tec? At first glance, Vault-Tec looks like a normal company. It acts like a normal company. Well, normal for Fallout. But if you examine its behaviors and actions, if you question the value of the data it generates or the value of the people it chooses to save versus those it chooses to sacrifice, it becomes clear that Vault-Tec isn't acting like the others. Sort of like Kim Philby or his fictional stand-in, Bill Hayden. John le Carré was a remarkable British novelist who worked in the spy thriller genre and, much like Ian Fleming of James Bond fame, came to it honestly, having worked for British intelligence in the late 50s and early 60s. Now, I really love all of his novels and would recommend virtually any of them, but if you're going to read le Carré, you start with Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which, and here's the kicker, is kind of based on the true story of Kim Philby, the Cambridge Five, and the thorough subversion/infiltration of British intelligence by the Soviets after World War II. Now, to the outside world, Philby was a journalist and diplomat. Importantly, though, he had also become a part of MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, sometime in 1940. His responsibilities included things like counterintelligence, anti-communism, and even communications between the US and UK at various times. He was also, and had always been, a Soviet spy, having been recruited by Soviet intelligence, the NKVD as far as I can tell, a forerunner of the KGB, in 1934, and worked diligently along with the 4 other elites recruited while they were also students at Cambridge in the 1930s to turn over literal pounds of top secret information to the Soviets and ensure the failure of operations against the USSR post-World War II. Which sounds an awful lot like the Vault-Tec we all question and fear, and given how things are going in the world today, it might even sound like I'm trying to make a larger Karsnov. Or point, I mean. Vault-Tec's cover is building bomb shelters, while their actual plan is to go into space with the Enclave. Or control the world. Or something? But in reality, they have always been working for someone or something else. To quote Churchill, they are a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. For me, though, Vault 96 is where the narrative of Vault-Tec really begins to fall apart. Nothing that Vault-Tec does here makes sense, either in terms of their cover story, Save Humanity, or their actual work, run experiments for the Enclave, or even one world under Vault-Tec. Clearly they were never really out to save the world, but I'm not convinced that their actual plan was to rule the world, or travel to space, or anything like that either. To my mind, those were red herrings, meant to throw us and anyone else who might be looking off the trail. Knowing that corporate greed and stupidity were rampant in the pre-war years, maybe we are inclined to write off Vault-Tec's truly odd behavior as the drive for profit, or maybe having ulterior motives that align with the Enclave, and maybe a few other things. But even then, it just doesn't make sense. Their plans, their methods, well, they seem so devious, but comically inept. What we see can't be what Vault-Tec is. So what is Vault-Tec? Good, bad, right, wrong, hero, villain? It's all really just a matter of perspective. To the west, Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, Donald MacLean, and the other members of the Cambridge Five were traitors. Villains whose actions led to the deaths of countless agents and the ruin of numerous operations, and ensured that the West would not defeat the East. To the Soviets, however, they were heroes of the highest order, true believers who protected not their homeland, but the idea of a classless world, and who ensured that the East could stand up to the West. The Cold War, or even during World War II, they were initially recruited in the mid-1930s and essentially stashed in the pocket of the NKVD, just in case. And wildly, this came so very close to being the greatest intelligence operation in history as, according to some accounts, Kim Philby was in contention to become chief of MI6 before being unmasked as a Soviet spy. Which one can only imagine the kind of damage that the leader of any agency, let alone an intelligence agency, could do if they were in the employ of a foreign power. So to us, in the mindset of a person living in the post-war hellscape that is Fallout, Vault-Tec seems both evil and unhinged. But that is largely a matter of our perspective. To understand Vault-Tec, we need to find the perspective from which their actions make sense. The Cambridge Five were upper-class Brits that looked and acted like all the other public school-educated spies. They weren't Marxist in their bad little suits, or Jewish or poor. They were presentable members of the ruling class whose failings, like so many of their class, were written off until they could no longer be ignored. They were amazing spies precisely because they were born of what they had come to loathe. So you're the Chinese communists and it's the 2020s, 30s, 40s. You're not in direct competition with the Americans. Sure, your political systems don't align, but you're essentially doing your own things. But down the road, you can see conflict. Maybe you don't want war. Maybe you do. But you assume it will happen. And it will be one hell of a war. Last man standing won't just win the war, they'll win everything. But society will need to be rebuilt from the ashes. And to do this, you'll need people that are talented and capable and resourceful. You'll want the rebirth of your nation to come from its best, and if you could somehow manage it, it would be better if your enemy lost all of their best. The idea comes as a realization, or a flash. Maybe it comes from a conversation or an idle thought. But with little tinkering, the same kinds of places you build to protect your best people could be used to destroy their best people. You have agents in America already, of course, but they're all outsiders. The communist infiltration of Mama Dolce's is comedic, a sort of campy, over-the-top 1950s style take on what Hollywood and B-movies thought communist subversion would look like. But it's also a pretty good distraction. Maybe you'll keep the FBI and other nosy folks busy with it. But those agents have met people. Children of the corporate caste who have become disillusioned with what America has become. Disillusioned with capitalism. They too are true believers, willing to fight and die for a little red book, but they are soft. And it only takes a little work to convince them that their true value to the revolution is not violence, but leadership and subversion. And so sometime around 2031, Vault-Tec comes into existence. Maybe you have a hand in it. Maybe it's simply Fortuna smiling down upon you. Your agents become executives of Vault-Tec, movers and shakers at the highest levels of business, intimates of the Enclave. Their cover is minimal and flawless, for they are unquestionably the elite. They profess their love for America by building vaults, and their love for the Enclave by doing its bidding. They ingratiate themselves to the big boys, the Robcos and Westecs, by offering up their services, and thus Vault-Tec looks a hell of a lot more like what actual communist subversion looked like than Mama Dolce's. Competent, but increasingly manic as the pressure increased, and dangerous when pressed. So again, what is Vault-Tec? Well, it's clear to me that only one thing explains Vault-Tec's behavior. They are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Chinese communists whose vaults were meant to act like sponges, soaking up, holding, and even wasting resources before and after a possible war with the Americans, to give the Chinese some kind of advantage. In simple terms, Vault-Tec and the vaults existed to remove things from the battlefield in as unobtrusive a way as possible. Now, clearly, not all moves in a war are going to be the winning stroke. Intelligence operations are often incremental. It wasn't enough to land the troops on D-Day. The Germans also needed to think that the invasion was happening on a given day and at a given place. And that is largely what the vaults were meant to do, give the American people and the powers that be a false sense of security. But when the bombs dropped and the doors closed, they would unleash true terror, trapping our best and brightest while subjecting them to experiments, keeping them occupied and off the board. And that, dear listener, that is the true nature of Vault-Tec.